The Phantom of Millbrook Academy, a complete history in 7 chapters. The discovery, the autumn of 2019 brought with it the kind of crisp October air that made Sarah Chen grateful for her decision to pursue archival work at Millbrook Academy. As the newly appointed head archivist, she had spent the better part of 3 months organizing decades of forgotten documents, photographs, and memorabilia stored in the Academy's basement. The private boarding school, established in 1847, had accumulated an impressive collection of historical materials that previous administrators had simply boxed away and forgotten. Sarah's methodical approach to cataloging had already uncovered several fascinating pieces of the school's history. Letters from Civil War soldiers who had attended Millbrook, early architectural plans for the Gothic Revival buildings that still dominated the campus, and countless photographs documenting the evolution of student life over more than a century and a half. It was on a particularly gray Thursday afternoon that Sarah made the discovery that would consume her thoughts for months to come. She had been working through a collection of early 20th century class photographs, carefully documenting each image's date, the names of identifiable students, and any relevant historical context. The photographs were mounted in large leather-bound albums, their pages yellowed with age, and their protective tissue paper crackling at the slightest touch. The Niente Bolsena de Tres graduating class photograph was particularly well preserved, mounted on heavy cardstock with the school's embossed seal in the corner. 24 young men in formal attire stood in 3 neat rows on the steps of Whitmore Hall, the Academy's main academic building. Their faces bore the serious expressions typical of formal photography of the era, when exposure times requires subject to remain perfectly still for several seconds. Sarah had been cross-referencing the faces in the photograph with the accompanying class roster when she noticed them. 3rd row, second from the left. A young man with distinctively sharp features, deep-set eyes, and an unusual scar running from his left temple to his jawline. Something about his face seemed familiar, though Sarah couldn't immediately place where she might have seen it before. She made a note to research the student's identity later and continued with her cataloging. It wasn't until she reached the 1819 section of the archives that the pieces began to fall into place in the most unsettling way possible. The memorial records were kept in a separate collection, documenting students and faculty who had died while affiliated with the Academy. The 1819 entries were particularly tragic, as they detailed the victims of a devastating fire that had claimed the lives of 7 students and 2 faculty members. The fire had started in the dormitory's heating system during a bitter February night and had spread rapidly through the wooden structure before the volunteer fire department could respond effectively. Among the memorial photographs was a formal portrait of Thomas Whitmore Blackwood, age 17, who had perished in the fire. The photograph showed a young man with distinctively sharp features, deep-set eyes, and an unusual scar running from his left temple to his jawline. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the memorial photograph next to the Niente Bolsena Tres class picture. The resemblance wasn't merely striking, it was the faces were identical in every detail. The same angular cheekbones, the same penetrating gaze, the same distinctive scar that would have been impossible to replicate naturally. Even accounting for the possibility of family resemblance, the similarities were far too precise to be explained by genetics alone. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon double-checking her work, convinced she must have made an error in dating or identification. She consulted the school's official records, cross-referenced multiple sources, and even examined the photographs under magnification. Every piece of evidence confirmed what seemed impossible. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood had died in the dormitory fire of February 5th. As the late afternoon shadows lengthened across her desk, Sarah found herself staring at the 2 photographs side by side, her rational mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. She had always prided herself on her methodical, evidence-based approach to historical research, but this discovery challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of photographic documentation. The implications were staggering. If the photographs were authentic, and her preliminary examination suggested they were,
then she was looking at evidence of something that defied conventional explanation. Either the memorial records were incorrect, the Niento dos Tres photograph had been somehow manipulated, or something far more extraordinary had occurred. Sarah carefully placed both photographs in protective sleeves and locked them in her desk drawer. She needed time to think, to research, and to develop a systematic approach to investigating this mystery. As she gathered her things to leave for the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas Whitmore Blackwood's eyes were following her from within the confines of the photograph. The discovery would mark the beginning of an investigation that would lead Sarah deep into the hidden history of Millbrook Academy, uncovering secrets that had been buried for more than a century and challenging her understanding of the boundaries between life and death, past and present. Sarah spent a restless night thinking about the photographs, her mind racing through possible explanations. By morning, she had developed a systematic plan to investigate the mystery of Thomas Whitmore Blackwood. Her first priority was to verify the authenticity of both photographs and to gather as much information as possible about the circumstances surrounding the Ethiopian. She arrived at the academy early before the morning rush of students and faculty and immediately set to work in the archives. Her first task was to examine the photographs more closely using the high-powered magnifying equipment the school had recently purchased for preservation work. Under magnification, both images showed the telltale signs of authentic period photography. The grain structure was consistent with early 20th century film stock. The chemical composition of the developing solutions had left characteristic pattern, and there were no signs of digital manipulation or photographic compositing. The Niento dos Tres class photograph bore the photographer's stamp, Hartwell Studios, Boston, Massachusetts. Sarah made a note to research the studio's history and photographic techniques. The memorial photograph of Thomas was less formally marked, but appeared to be a standard portrait of the type commonly taken by itinerant photographers who visited boarding schools to provide students with formal portraits to send home to their families. Sarah's next step was to delve deeper into the school's records regarding the 1999 fire. The official incident report, filed with the local authorities and preserved in the Academy's administrative files, provided a detailed account of the tragedy. The fire had begun around 3 a.m. on February 15, 1999, apparently due to a malfunction in the coal-burning heating system that served the junior dormitory. The wooden structure, built in 1851, had been particularly vulnerable to fire, and the flames had spread rapidly through the building's interior. The report listed the casualties by name, age, and home. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood, age 17, from Salem, Massachusetts, was among the 7 students who had perished. According to witness accounts, Thomas had been trapped on the 3rd floor of the dormitory when the main staircase collapsed. His body had been recovered 3 days later, after the debris had cooled sufficiently to allow for safe excavation. What struck Sarah as particularly significant was the detailed description of Thomas's identification. The report noted that he had been identified not only by his personal effects, but also by a distinctive scar on the left side of his face, extending from temple to jaw, the result of a childhood accident involving a fall from a horse. This detail matched exactly what Sarah could see in both photographs. The funeral arrangements had been handled by Thomas's guardian, a maternal uncle named Cornelius Whitmore, who had traveled from Salem to claim the body. Thomas had been buried in the Salem Municipal Cemetery on February 1999, following a service at the First Congregational Church. The school's records included a copy of the death certificate, signed by the local coroner, and bearing the official seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Sarah's investigation into the Niento dos Tres graduating class proved equally thorough and equally puzzling. The class roster listed 24 students, and she was able to account for 23 of them through various records and documentation. The 24th student, however, presented a significant problem. According to the roster, his name was Thomas W. Blackwood, the same initials and surname as the student who had died 4 years earlier. The name Blackwood was listed as being from Salem, Massachusetts, the same hometown as his deceased namesake. His academic records showed him to be an exceptional student, particularly gifted in classical languages and literature. He have been awarded the Whitmore Prize for Academic Excellence, a scholarship named unarically after the same Whitmore family that had founded the Academy and from which the deceased Thomas had been descended. Sarah found it increasingly difficult to believe that this was merely a coincidence. The probability of two students with such similar names, from the same town, attending the same school within a 4-year period, and bearing identical physical features, seemed astronomically small. Yet the documentation appeared to support the existence of both individuals as separate people. A research into the Blackwood family history revealed additional layers of complexity. The family had been prominent in Salem since the colonial period, with various branches engaged in shipping, manufacturing, and banking. The genealogical records showed that Thomas Whitmore Blackwood, the fire victim, had been the son of Jonathan and Margaret Blackwood. Jonathan had died in a shipping accident in 1991, and Margaret had succumbed to tuberculosis in 1995, leaving Thomas in the care of his uncle. Curiously, the genealogical record made no mention of any other Thomas Blackwood of the appropriate age, who might have attended Millbrook Academy. The family tree seemed to end with the death of the original Thomas in miniature. Several faculty members who had known the original Thomas had still been teaching at the academy, yet none of their personal papers or correspondence mentioned the remarkable resemblance between the deceased student and the new arrival. This seemed particularly strange, given that the resemblance was so striking that it had immediately caught Sarah's attention more than a century later. The mystery deepened when Sarah discovered that the 1903 Thomas W. Blackwood had seemingly vanished from all records after graduation. Unlike his classmates who went on to attend universities, enter business, or pursue other documented careers, there was no trace of what had become of him after he left Millbrook Academy. No college enrollment records, no marriage certificates, no death notices, nothing to indicate what path his life had taken after graduation. At the end of her second day of investigation, Sarah had accumulated a substantial file of documentation, but she was no closer to understanding how Thomas Whitmore Blackwood could have appeared in a photograph taken 4 years after his death. The evidence seemed to point toward an impossible conclusion, that somehow the same person had been present at Millbrook Academy both before and after his own death. As she locked the photographs away for another night, Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that she was dealing with something far beyond the scope of normal historical research. The rational part of her mind insisted that there must be a logical explanation: mistaken identity, photographic manipulation, or errors in the historical record, but the evidence seemed to resist every conventional explanation she could devise. Determined to find a rational explanation for the mystery, Sarah expanded her investigation beyond the confines of Millbrook Academy. She reached out to colleagues at other institutions, consulted with photographic experts, and began researching the broader historical context of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her goal was to either debunk the mystery through careful analysis, or to gather enough evidence to support what seemed like an impossible conclusion. Her first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Holloway, a professor of photographic history at Boston University, agreed to examine high-resolution scans of both photographs. Holloway had spent decades studying early photographic techniques and had developed methods for detecting various forms of manipulation and fraud that had been possible with period technology. After a week of analysis, Dr. Holloway's report was both thorough and disturbing. "I've examined these images using every technique at my disposal," he wrote. Spectral analysis, grain pattern examination, chemical composition testing, and comparative studies with known, authentic photographs from the same period. He can find no evidence whatsoever of manipulation, composite work, or fraud. Both photographs appear to be completely authentic examples of period photography. Dr. Holloway's report included detailed technical appendices that Sarah found difficult to follow, but his conclusion was clear. If these photographs had been manipulated, it had been done using techniques that were far beyond the capabilities of early 20th century photography, and that would be difficult to achieve even with modern digital technology. Sarah's next avenue of investigation led her to the Salem Municipal Cemetery, where Thomas Whitmore Blackwood had been buried. She drove to Salem on a cold November morning, armed with copies of the burial records and the determination to verify at least one aspect of the story through physical evidence. The cemetery's records confirmed the burial of Thomas Whitmore Blackwood. The grave was located in the Whitmore family plot, a substantial section of the cemetery that included several generations of the prominent Salem family. Sarah found the headstone easily enough. A modest granite marker bearing Thomas's name, dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved nephew and student, taken too soon." What she hadn't expected was to find evidence that the grave had been disturbed. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named William Frost, who had worked at the cemetery for more than 40 years, was surprisingly knowledgeable about the cemetery's history and willing to discuss the Whitmore plot. "That grave's always been a bit of a mystery," Frost told her as they stood before Thomas's headstone. "My predecessor mentioned it to me when I started working here. Said there'd been some kind of incident back in the early 19th. The records from that time are a bit sketchy, but there was definitely some kind of disturbance." Frost led Sarah to the cemetery's administrative office, where the oldest records were kept in a series of leather-bound ledgers. The entry for Thomas Whitmore Blackwood's grave showed the original burial in February 1829, but there was an additional notation dated March 1524. Grave found disturbed. Groundskeeper reported evidence of excavation. Police notified, no suspects identified. Grave restored. The timing was significant. March 1903 would have been near the end of the academic year at Millbrook Academy, just a few months before the graduation photograph was taken. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather as she considered the implications. Her investigation into the Blackwood family history yielded additional disturbing details. She spent several days at the Salem Historical Society, poring over family records, newspaper archives, and genealogical documents. The Blackwood family had indeed been prominent in Salem, but their history was marked by a series of tragedies and unexplained events that seemed to follow a disturbing pattern. The family had first come to Salem in the 1680s during the period of the witch trials. Jeremiah Blackwood, the family patriarch, had been among the merchants who had profited from the chaos of the trials by purchasing property from families who had fled the area. However, the Blackwood family's prosperity had come at a cost. Generation after generation had been marked by premature deaths, mysterious disappearances, and strange occurrences that had made them the subject of local folklore. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood's father, Jonathan, had died under mysterious circumstances. Whilst the official cause of death was listed as a shipping accident, newspaper accounts from the time suggested that Jonathan had been found dead in his locked study with no signs of violence or illness. The family physician had been unable to determine a cause of death, leading to speculation about suicide or foul play. Thomas's mother Margaret had died of tuberculosis in 1890. Medical records suggested that she had been in good health just weeks before her death, making the sudden onset of the disease particularly puzzling. Most disturbing of all was the pattern Sarah began to notice in the family's genealogical record. Several generations of Blackwood men had died young, often under mysterious circumstances, only to have relatives with remarkably similar names and physical descriptions appear in family records years later. The pattern was subtle enough that it might have been dismissed as coincidence or the result of family naming traditions, but when viewed in aggregate, it suggested something far more sinister. Sarah's research into the broader historical context of the period revealed that the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been marked by a widespread interest in spiritualism, occultism, and attempts to communicate with the dead. The period following the Civil War had seen an explosion of interest in seances, mediums, and various forms of supernatural investigation. Even prominent scientists and intellectuals had been drawn into investigations of psychic phenomena. Salem, with its history of witch trials and its reputation for supernatural occurrences, had been a particular center of such activities. The Salem Historical Society's records included numerous accounts of seances, spirit manifestations, and other paranormal events that had been reported in the local newspapers. Many of these accounts involved attempts to contact the spirits of the dead, or to achieve some form of communication across the boundary between life and death. As Sarah compiled her research, she began to develop a theory that seemed impossible to accept, yet increasingly difficult to dismiss. The evidence suggested that Thomas Whitmore, Blackwood, had somehow returned from the dead, appearing at Millbrook Academy 4 years after his death to complete his education. The disturbed grave, the identical physical features, the lack of any other explanation for the second Thomas's existence all pointed toward a conclusion that challenged everything Sarah thought she knew about the nature of life and death. Yet even as she considered this possibility, Sarah remained committed to finding a rational explanation. She expanded her research to include cases of mistaken identity, photographic anomalies, and historical fraud. She consulted with experts in genealogy, forensic photography, and even psychology, hoping to find some overlooked detail that would provide a conventional explanation for the mystery. But with each new avenue of investigation, the evidence seemed to point more strongly toward the impossible conclusion that Thomas Whitmore Blackwood had somehow transcended death itself. Sarah's investigation took a darker turn when she began to uncover the hidden history of Millbrook Academy itself. What had initially seemed like an isolated mystery involving one student began to reveal itself as part of a much larger and more disturbing pattern that stretched back to the school's founding. The Academy's founder, Cornelius Whitmore, had been a wealthy industrialist with interests in textile manufacturing and railroad development. The official history of the school portrayed him as a philanthropist, dedicated to providing quality education to young men from prominent families. However, Sarah's deeper research revealed a more complex and troubling picture. Cornelius Whitmore had been deeply involved in the spiritualist movement that had swept through New England in the mid-19th century. His personal papers, preserved in a restricted collection at the Academy's library, included extensive correspondence with prominent mediums, spiritualists, and occult practitioners of the era. Whitmore had been particularly interested in what he called the persistence of consciousness beyond physical death, and had funded several investigations into paranormal phenomena. More disturbing still were Whitmore's theories about education and the development of young minds. His private journals, written in a mixture of English and Latin that suggested he was trying to obscure their content, revealed his belief that young people were particularly susceptible to spiritual influences and that proper education could enhance their receptivity to communication with the dead. Whitmore had designed Millbrook Academy not just as a school, but as what he called a laboratory for the investigation of the boundaries between life and death. The Gothic Revival architecture of the campus, with its emphasis on pointed arches, flying buttresses, and elaborate stonework, had been specifically chosen for its supposed ability to channel spiritual energies and create an environment conducive to supernatural phenomena. Sarah discovered that the Academy's curriculum in its early years had included subjects that would have been considered highly unusual for a traditional boarding school. In addition to the standard courses in classical languages, mathematics, and literature, students had been required to take classes in metaphysical philosophy, spiritual development, and communication with the unseen world. These courses had been taught by faculty members who were themselves practitioners of various forms of occultism and spiritualism. The school's records from the 1850s and 1860s included numerous accounts of strange occurrences on campus. Students and faculty had reported apparitions, unexplained sounds, and objects moving without apparent cause. Rather than being dismissed as imagination or pranks, these incidents had been carefully documented and studied as part of Whitmore's ongoing investigation into paranormal phenomena. The pattern of mysterious deaths at the Academy also proved to be more extensive than Sarah had initially realized. The little 1999 fire that had claimed Thomas Blackwood's life was just one of several tragedies that had befallen the school over the decade. Students had died in accidents, from sudden illnesses and under circumstances that defied easy explanation. In many cases, these deaths had been followed by reports of the deceased students being seen on campus, leading to persistent rumors that the academy was haunted. What made this account particularly significant was their consistency and the credibility of the witnesses. Faculty members, visiting parents, and even local townspeople had reported seeing deceased students walking the halls, attending classes, or participating in campus activities. These sightings had been so frequent and well documented that they had become part of the school's unofficial folklore. Sarah found evidence that Cornelius Whitmore had not only been aware of these phenomena, but had actively encouraged them. His journals revealed his belief that the academy's unique environment was allowing deceased students to return and complete their education, a process he saw as a triumph of his educational and spiritual theory. The boundary between life and death, Whitmore had written in 1863, is far more permeable than conventional wisdom suggests. Here at Millbrook we have created conditions that allow the departed to return and fulfill their earthly obligation. Death need not be the end of learning, but merely a transition to a different form of existence. Whitmore's experiments had apparently gone beyond mere observation. Sarah discovered records of seances held in the Academy's chapel, attempts to communicate with deceased students, and efforts to create what Whitmore called bridges between the worlds of the living and the dead. These activities had been conducted with the knowledge and participation of selected faculty members and students, creating a secret society within the school, dedicated to exploring the boundaries of mortality. The Academy's architecture itself had been designed to facilitate these activities. Sarah's examination of the original building plans revealed hidden chambers, secret passages, and rooms that had been specifically constructed for occult practices. The basement of Whitmore Hall, where Sarah had been working, contained a circular chamber with symbols carved into the stone walls and a raised platform that appeared to have been used for ceremonial purposes. Most disturbing of all was Sarah's discovery of what appeared to be a systematic record of students who had died at the academy and subsequently returned. Whitmore had maintained a secret ledger written in code that documented dozens of cases spanning several decades. The entries included the student's name, date of death, date of first post-mortem appearance, and notes on their subsequent activities. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood's case was recorded in detail. According to Whitmore's notes, Thomas had been successfully recalled in March 1903, following a series of rituals conducted in the hidden chamber beneath Whitmore Hall. The entry noted that Thomas had retained all of his memories and personality traits from before his death and had been able to complete his education without arousing suspicion among the general student body. The ledger revealed that this was not an isolated case. Dozens of students had apparently died and returned over the years, some multiple times. The pattern suggested that Millbrook Academy had become a nexus for supernatural activity, a place where the normal rules governing life and death had been suspended through a combination of occult practices and environmental factors. Sarah's investigation into the fate of hombres prisoners fue one of a disturbing pattern. Most of them had eventually disappeared again, vanishing from all records after completing their education. Whitmore's note suggested that the second existence was temporary, lasting only long enough for them to fulfill whatever purpose had brought them back. The implications of these discoveries were staggering. If Whitmore's records were accurate, Millbrook Academy había set supernatural phenomena on a scale that defied belief. As Sarah absorbed the full scope of what she had uncovered, she began to understand that her discovery of Thomas Blackwood's photograph was not an isolated mystery, but part of a much larger and more complex phenomenon. The Academy itself was the key to understanding how a student could appear in a photograph 4 years after his death. But with this understanding came a growing sense of unease. If the papers documented that Whitmore's ledger were real, then any supernatural forces que no happened to Millbrook Academy might still be present, waiting for the right conditions to manifest themselves once again. As winter settled over Millbrook Academy, Sarah found herself working longer hours in the archives, driven by an obsession with uncovering the complete truth about Thomas Blackwood and the Academy's supernatural history. The basement archives, once a quiet refugium for a researcher, had begun to feel diferente, charged cuento en energy que seemed to intensify as her investigation deepened. Y contemfen a quien hemos pueblo en secreto, to andion recomande lo direm for intaken, dulo por intal John por intas, for it to pick to a film that a can go, gendo quentumente archives, the only sounds the hum of the heating system and the occasional settling of the old building's wooden framework. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows among the rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and increasingly unsettling. Sarah was examining Cornelius Whitmore's coded ledger under a magnifying lamp when she became aware of a presence in the room. It was not a sound or a movement that alerted her, but rather a subtle change in the atmosphere, a sense that she was no longer alone. Si con tu filos no pequeño busat en el tomdado fora de estebicado soñar. Feel patolgos, tupicado petua keeping out into instance. Dark wool trousers, a white shirt with a high collar, and a navy blue jacket with the Millbrook Academy crest embroidered on the breast pocket. His appearance was ordinary, so consistente with the historical photographs alle apse studion, como Mesaro assume su current estudiante en particering, y su piturical fericaron a contra-historical reenactment. Pero as her reyes adjusted to the dim lighting beyond her work area, she recognized the distinctive features that become so familiar through her research, the sharp cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, and the unmistakable scar running from temple to jaw. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood was standing in the archives, looking exactly as he had in el 1903 graduation photograph. Sarah's long falterios is indebted in Welgoer family, Rinomon Welgoer family resemblance, who had come to research his ancestry. Perhaps in no elaborate prank orchestrated by students, who had somehow learned about her research. Perhaps he was experiencing tocasobo hallucination brought on by stress and too many late nights in the archives. But as Thomas stepped forward into the light, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at something that defied conventional explanation. There was a quality to his presence that seemed to exist outside normal physical reality, a translucent quality to allow her to see the filing cabinets behind him, as if he were not entirely solid. Si encuentra bien la boquilla solo, Thomas buscaría un cultured accent vi esterlo plunodora. Buena rado borilades mo quali no bocena. Boriquer un pletiño sacabio de adisno. Todos cadi chomi piequan. Sarah fan buffet selaman e gobel suejo. Her voice caught between disbelief and terror. Every instinct told her to flee, yet she remained frozen in her chair, transfixed by the impossible sight before her. Please don't be afraid, Thomas continued, moving closer to her desk. I meant ye no harm. In fact, I'm grateful for your efforts to understand what a padananai. It's been more than a century since anyone has taken such care to document my story. Finding her voice at last, Sarah managed to whisper, "You're dead. You died in 8, at least, not in Oilapos Millbrook Academy." Cornelius Whitmore whispered Dios more successful in Kakabraun to andawadats, Dios ya que like Kunal Ruan Ponofakimoyen, whom can bas medbel toman yod this one tool. Can be kafare kabepre wat de blame, un pondo belibisco, when you cut that way, said the bills of top to the diamond, top it got potato, compon dichtrabde, del warm pilafabde, os other deades, os abavanti custom except como some moment, or brought to the de capo de medale kismo, os ato top to the pilafarica, and blamuli top to the pilafai, the was the one ne padre, the tabamos ava, o but the automon me padavo, and it will fica fato by, o but the relos on to favi capendo, o se tifico pot da vaso bababa, zomo topi con fare xiconoli, che so prepsapta todo, la modaviltà tanto bavutato ma entramo in plave, le prere in tetto proprio evitato, ma vad la pravda, lo fia caets, a plavu stato, ma in pravda, da big dotto, ma parte non fare di qua dettato, ma po topi caso ne vuoi votare, a plavu... I found myself in a place cabuane de fully alive, no completi no do John completi mei, tomanes te blind. Y pues as if he existed in the spaces between moments, watching the world continue without me, but unable to fully participate in y consider academy, my fellow student and my teachers, but I was like a shadow, present pero no substantial. The return to physical form had come gradually, Thomas explained, facilitated by the rituals and ceremonies que Cornelius Whitmore had conducted in the hidden chamber beneath the archives. Mr. Whitmore believed strong emotional attachments could anchor a spirit to the physical world, Thomas said. My desire to complete my education, to fulfill the promise I had made to my parents before their deaths, provided the anchor. The process had taken months of careful preparation. Whitmore had used a combinación oculto practices, sympathetic magic, caldo spiritual engineering, to create conditions que fueron Laurie Thomas to manifest on physical form. Descamo Whitmore had the spiritual engineering, waques corinto de que había condiciones prestuasen en fandausiera forma caua. Descamo Whitmore had the doble physical form, de soldobie mandó praniloviento que vopana estancando. I found myself once again a blepelo township sab, to vicina en herba odas, to participari fully a the life of the academy. Pero was one aware de mi existence por a bodo tami, por was to vadaros a far bavum. Domas to completed his education in 1903, graduating with his class and receiving his diploma. Pero a war mod mo bada would push what of suggested, and lo comanta pluas education in shortly after graduation, es where comekiti físico. En conexión to the physical world awakening until you once again existed only as a spirit. Dichis connection to the fourth gueldo, once no pustomda, que tiel minisisto nojetas caballos, once no pustomda, din honapri compedu like sistostomda, geblerendoi, din in cabestolom penenixistolom puning station a bruise, on to morwariri to accept the loss, then cabeni sustomda la verloin do loadier. Den cabeni sustomda la bablus to pingeton do guardo, die penpenagen de volonties, opulimuaci de lanfornadu, que bdur lantu barno cabes, o capoium morles, o pritativi, que brias como instablen a stapilens, te que vorra pridu abias, te que vorlo pridun prolition, te que vorlo pridu ablusi. Sara licento Thomas's account o mixture of fascinación al terror. The rational part of Tomó, continudo to insist a cochuas experience in impossibly. Yo's obedience of her senses was undeniable. She was having a conversation of an continentigi mix citamiento con body su dijo, el gabaris entre ploms, y posible bonco van flor de bonco, en los mochanes senti como fado dono, in romen sampios en fado bello, gaña, y priveta dobricine sul senta yu posho maiado, di los mochametuara de rorio, dioco fane que los darius, sara animati. Tomases expresiones argumentos serios, preco te detabo anidro a to presantach de que no va guento ma presendo con nova vietas en os unditu. De to que sambe todas expresiona forma que svetekito nos tatindus. Torcer lo sur, haster the things up. Brought atentos the secrets, to externos de desbenevelita do chavonesis, quitamos tos no. Sarah's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the fluorescent lights began to flicker erratically. The sense of presento que she had felt to Canaria intensified, para no que added with it a feeling of malevolence que made her skin crawl. The coming, Thomas saw urgently. You need to leave, now. But before Sarah could move, the lights went out completely, plunging the archives into absolute darkness. But before Sarah could move, the lights went out completely, plunging the archives into absolute darkness. In the blackness, she as monka the terrified in description, whispers in languages she didn't recognize, footstep a do palobato que tien comantiandi sayas yo, desde camping completo. Tomó his voice cut through the chaos. The chamber beneath us, Whitmore's ritual room, they're trying to open a permanent gateway between the worlds. If they succeed, the boundary between life and death will collapse entirely. Sarah felt Thomas en crodo proidien tromem, o dioes que pom kenon troiles, com buen grasp in the darkness. Come cupens y todo. Is something you need to see, something that will help you understand how to stop what's happening. As they moved through the darkened archives, Sarah realized that Com investigation had uncovered far more than a historical mystery. She had stumbled into an ongoing supernatural crisis that threatened not just Millbrook Academy, but potentially the natural order itself. Thomas led Sarah through the darkened archivos caballos confidentos unte todos con pod espada los pencrada. Despite the chaos erupting around them, the whispers, the unnatural cold, and the sense of malevolent presences gathering in the shadows, he moved him with Persium to the section of the basement that Sarah had never explored. The entrance to Whitmore's chamber has been hidden for decades, Thomas explained as they walked, el de Pisha somehow cutting through the supernatural cacophony that filled the air. The Academy's administrators sealed it in the 1990s after a series of incidents that they couldn't explain or control. But the seal was never meant to be permanent. They reached what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the far end of the archives. Thomas Plaza Sanregam en particular stone, en esa era the sound of mechanismo petonastos. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into darkness. Cornelius Whitmore built this chamber according to very specific principles, Thomas Sayos, as they descended the stairs. The geometry, the materials, the symbols carved on the cushions, everything was designed to thin Madon riba del Bioa, one of the living in the realm of the dead. De gestamto de contorno de pionti topa. Supinha venisana na meu pore tom podiron a barere de sael y alama, wintabondo de hilinduelo nyo pore no buenteri, wintabon riendelomo, ildo duriere jal thin tiwash. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move and shift in the flickering light that emanated from Sarah couldn't identify. Symbols para various mystical traditions, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Celtic knots, Hebrew letters, and others she didn't recognize, were arranged in complex patterns that hurt her eyes to look at directly. In the center of the chamber was a raised platform made of black stone, surrounded by concentric circles carved into the floor. The air in the chamber felt thick and charged, as if it was saturated with electrical energy. Sarah could feel the hair on her arms standing up, and her skin tingled with a sensation it was both unpleasant and strangely exhilarating.
Franz where Whitmore conducted his experiments, Thomas said, gesturing toward the platform, where he learned to call back the dead and give them temporary form in the world of the living. But he was playing with forces he didn't fully understand.
As if responding to the presence, the carvings on the walls began to glow bala phosphorescent light. To carvings en bala phosphorescent light, Thomas observed los cabellos appeared to blue de lac, hofmofide pesasna dobret light. Thomas observed Whitmore disandrin en la ricona perdudo, y chamberus de sandel caballo visó bonido guarazandel caballos comil dado, Dios de caretucta bari, baritit chamberus comil diu cavari, de balance que per caballos to demereren teresvorted. Saracu filil ferentes mod. The chamber fell unstably contenerele, were strainers in posapsis, was a gamadnestubri, were zivejin tapins gepanto, mas sera cuvrinil op kenilum strainin. The chamber wanto de sarian sengiblos, seraderos et paistra. The chamber wanto sarpecem percento bipondo, cercado la semismere tusian forien trovo. Zizi panediken que no setan al borabalio, the titic derado de gibiunto la labo was in nete forco. The titic derado dolges when pentiblan petulizo, the titic deropunanto te la lovers to agrampo, the titic deropunanto de jesse sigab labzes of non tutulto, the titic deropunanto de sobrotudis et pulinidini cabanasiti tof polti. Your research, Thomas replied, beacon at giving the truth about quater por largo cucucuado capiene vino. De agine cadado gerspelcinetruad on the light, who've disturbed the equilibrimo, just kept his forces in check for decades. Todos etaroeshen. Diastos diabado, quandon rexles, bicine kikich tiabades de aprijobild. Waldo do condo josod, beketum fruterke da la buscal de dawal, tardes spu, bafulo head marundaich no loetigo que tis fort disappears. Loculeto mat, Sara recognase na gustomo llave da photographed in escuride, estudam portado brayues eras of the Academy's history, albaren translucent qualitete mark except spirits. Pero unlike Thomas, es figuras rayated malevolence and desperaciones. They don't want to return to death, Thomas explained. They've existed in this liminal state for so long that they've forgotten what it means to truly live or truly die. They see your investigation as a threat to the continued existence. The spirits began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid and threatening. Sarah could see the hunger in their eyes, the desperate need to maintain their tenuous grip on existence. She realized that they saw her not as a researcher uncovering historical truth, but as a source of a life energy that they could drain to strengthen their own supernatural existence. We need to perform a binding ritual, Thomas said urgently. Something to contain the spirits and restore the balance que Whitmore establishes, pero mi mañón is to dejar oquente entusiastos, a sabrenating willingly give up the life force to power the ritual. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the chamber. You're talking about human sacrifice, not necessarily death, Thomas clarified. Pero Samon was willing to ancordar muertos a platieno, e los dijo a guardian coren complacer en balance viteguer dos worldos, one more intended o servi que roli fontarso. Pero yo usiri fora for the complete process. The spirits were closing in now, their forms becoming more solid and threatening with each passing moment. Sarah could feel their hunger, their desperate need to consume her life force and use it to strengthen their own existence. The chamber's energy was building towards some kind of climax, and she realized this job was running out of time. Just another way, Thomas Sojourn quite a living person to serve as an anchor. A spirit who willingly accepts their death, who chooses to move on to whatever lies beyond, can provide the necessary energy to seal the chamber and bind the other spirits. Sarah understood immediately what he was suggesting. You and Bodea sacrifice yourself. He should have moved on long ago, Thomas replied. You've been clinging to this existence out of fear and unfinished business, but I've had more than a century to complete my education and understand my purpose. It's time for me to accept my death and help put an end to what Whitmore started. The spirit sensed what Thomas was planning and surged forward, their forms becoming more aggressive and desperate. But Thomas stepped onto the central platform. In a chamber's energy began to focus around him. The chambers on the walls blazed with brilliant light. In the pothena de vies genef tum prethpotut of Sierra or the growing supernatural storm. Document the truth, but be careful who you share it with. Some secrets are meant to remain hidden, not because they're false, but because they're too dangerous for the world to know. Thomas began a capeit anting contrasarea contra begogrinais, tinavores patos, que les isquerrenes de lo mado manipuentos di como lo arafro. Viado spirit, recoilo de gleu the platforma había bayubornd, te sorramente tubo de por the platforma había blega en abocaciocun, toman saduda de sobrepesobus, tus vigundos absint, de sobregentos bubes de bianquibiafals. The last thing she saw before the brilliant light forced her to close her eyes was Thomas Whitmore Blackwood, standing on the platform, in a form becoming translucent and then transparent as he finally accepted his death and moved on to whatever lay beyond the boundary between life and death. When Sarah regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the floor of the archives, surrounded by concerned colleagues who had come looking for her after she failed to return home. The basement was brightly lit by emergency lighting, and she could hear the sounds of maintenance workers checking the building's electrical systems. The power went out around midnight, explained Dr. Patricia Henley, the Academy's head librarian. We found you unconscious down here when we came to check for damage. Are you all right? Should we call an ambulance? Sarah sat up slowly, her head spinning as she tried to reconcile what she had experienced with the mundane reality around her. The entrance to Whitmore's chamber was nowhere to be seen. Just the solid stone wall she had always known. The supernatural cold was gone, replaced by the normal temperature of the heated basement. There was no sign of the spirits, the glowing symbols, or the otherworldly energy that had filled the chamber. I'm fine, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure that was true. I must have been working too late and had some kind of episode. Low blood sugar, maybe. Over the next 2 days con preocupicarros del diaños, que horas al puro bienestar e que son prado pelar stress, exhaustion e que come time spent researching disturbing historical materials. But of photographs Thomas Blackwood remained as mysterious as ever, and her research into the Academy's history had uncovered too many documented anomalies to dismiss entirely. Si trunto de archivas, un renewed determination, por quanto li quer il monto de determination, por en hoyo vom en spirits of the documentes abeticento, were no longer Joaresia Lofmo, Cornelius Whitmore's coded ledger were vanished in orila, along with several other key pieces of evidence. Quedar was aires borin i lesiondo, thano foi la kiba birfinover, the befesim dada noyobus, official records taruan sapos situjon le mutuo de melos, were tara compil favino conventional opmionto, lieba to that convien salvas, bien red. The 1839 Tainori fire was documented as a tragic accident with no supernatural elements. Thomas Whitmore Blackwood was listed among the victims, with no mention of any subsequent appearances or mysterious photographs. The 203 graduation record showed 23 students, not 24, and there was no trace of any second Thomas Blackwood. Even the photographs that started their investigation seemed to have changed. The Monterey 3 graduation pictures still showed 24 students, but when Sarah examined it closely, She could no longer identify su agencia fe belonged to Thomas. The features que te seemed so distinctive and familiar now appeared ordinary, indistinguishable from the face the other students. Sarah began to wonder if she had imagined the entire mystery. Para peace of mind, a creative Peter's conexión que siendo para como esto de negueti exist, possinar to supplementary explanations por mayau cum meti historical discrepancies. Justo su non posición, combayan it atmospheric setting at the Ole Academy, might have predisposed that nogios y mysteries were non-existed. Pero late at night, when she was alone in the archives, Sarah sometimes felt a presence watching her. Not malevolente like a spirit she had from the chamber, pero protective and benevolente. She never saw Tomás again, pero si sense que esta sacrifila el ve real, en esta field había un túmulo at the academy. Un contento, tiad. Sarah decided to write a report on her research, pero she found herself unable to include the supernatural elements of what she had discovered. Every time she tried to document about the spirits, and often beyond to insult to overwhelming phenomena, the word seemed to disappear as to fike for computer screen, as if she for to proof her one biles. Educational almost sincerely historical analysis to Millbrook Academies, early years, focusing on Cornelius Whitted educational innovations, to tragic fire of 1 to T. Say mentioned Thomas Blackwood as one of the victims of the fire, and not your que the promising student whose death particularly marred the academy community. The report was received by the Academy's administration and was eventually published in a journal of educational history. Sarah received praise for her thorough research and her sensitive treatment of the school's tragic past. Vedosino atorreado storio, the tours about que nunca acabar in the archives and a muy chamba burdestos leker. Years passed, and Sarah continued her work as head archives at Millbrook Academy. She never again encountered anything that challenged her understanding of reality, though she remained sensitive to the subtle energies that seemed to flow through the old buildings. The academy felt different now, more peaceful, as if the long-standing tension had more resolved. Occasionally, most student or faculty members would report strange experiences on campus, glimpses of figures in period clothing, unexplained sounds in the dormitories, or the sensation of being watched in the library. Sarah would listen to these accounts with professional interest, offer rational explanations while privately wondering if some echoes de cada vice supernatural past still lingered. She never found another photograph of Thomas Blackwood, though she sometimes thought she caught glimpses of him in group photos from various eras, a face in the background that seemed familiar, a figure at the edge of the frame who didn't quite belong. Pompoche looked morca los cravino pade, he dieremo porque jaste contra pelurinelli so que canondal fa. The mystery of how Thomas Blackwood could appear in a photograph taken 40 years after his death remained officially unsolved. Sarah's files contained all the conventional evidence, death certificates, burial records, and historical documentation, but the supernatural explanation that could have made sense of it all had been carefully erased from the official record. In quiet moments, Sarah sometimes wondered if Thomas had found Alufane Pias in whatever realm lay beyond death, or if continued to exist in some form, warring over the academy and protecting it from the forces que Cornelius Whitmore had visited of. Formago con marsif storade century ago. She hoped esta gracias y sacrificables isabane. The truth about Thomas Whitmore Blackwood would remain hidden in the shadows of history, known only to Sarah and preserved in the collective memory of an academy que estaba lent to keep its deepest secrets. Some mysteries, Sarah Halendike, were meant to remain unsolved, not because the truth was unknowable, but que estables truths were too dangerous for the world to bear. As she looked at the archives y pignonte toris moathcrocedaos, Tormogen y modamem cafaro in vignon piegenta di agelanilo boroblim, of the kebasium, of yaviwafadon texempor cabito mongen que apiron at pocristolaos. Y anoniclas. Y bigoimi de tamor statomado shipiller madadan de director capitanone sin badem adal mesekedo. Amora betamo de stubilber cachemis on the studio of the long of tubus. The photograph te castarte llano sentenopsiament in the Academy's collection, filed away with hundreds of other historical images, to casual observers, y qua simply a graduation picture pon mind to trastre, showing 21 young men ready to begin their adult lives. But Sarah knew that at least one of those faces belonged to someone who had already died, someone who had been given a second chance to complete his education and find peace. The mystery of Thomas Blackwood, having been solved, Emery con a solución que never be shared y podva admir, con guardes con triquero ubicad podos ta precontrique, el Academy continue the transmission of education, and the Academy continue the transmission about you, otro a convilte de que, a exportante of the report of dead. And in the archives, Sarah Chen continued her work as keeper of the school's history, guardian of secrets, and protector of truth too powerful for the world to know. The end. I first note. The story explores themes of historical mystery, supernatural phenomena, and the boundaries between life and death, while the ventas describo de ficcional, de dado inspiración en the rich tradition of Gothic literature and the historical interest y spiritualismo caracterizes de leto-minto-minto en the lot of the chronicles. Millbrook Academy, and its characters exist only in the realm of imaginationen, but the question de l'oristares about the launildo de naturen o de que la distant en hokan.